Hello, my name is Eamon Donahue, and this is an analysis of the decline and fall of the Bengal province as the impetus for the fall of the Mughal Empire and the rise of the British Empire in India. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to provide you the abstract, as well as the sources and the bibliography that I used to come to my conclusions. I'll explain the overall timeline of the Mughal collapse, the period of European exploration which brought Europe to the subcontinent, how Britain and the East India Company began to emerge as regional and global powers, the emerging relationship between Bengal and the company, the Battle of Plassey, the Seven Years' War, and the company's conquest of Bengal and the region in general. And finally, I'll discuss my conclusions, which include what the collapse means in the overall arc of history, what historians get wrong, what they get right, and why they conclude as much. This is my abstract, and the summary concludes that the common understanding of the British Empire as an exclusively oppressive force, and the native Indian population as a peaceful civilization exploited by a brutal foreign power is anachronistic, and it really ignores the hugely complex nature of Mughal civilization as well as the British Empire's rise. It's a relatively recent phenomenon developed by a multitude of scholars, journalists, and historians, and it completely ignores the chronology, complexity, and the multifaceted causality of Mughal decline and British ascent in the region. Furthermore, this idea ignores the fact that the impetus for the collapse, that is, the Battle of Plassey in 1757, occurs in a 20-year time frame, which was a critical juncture in world history, including what was effectively the First World War, or global military campaign, if you will, and the advent of the American Republic. Here are what my sources look like. My primary sources included things like charters, treaties, letters, and correspondences. This includes the original East India Company charter signed by Queen Elizabeth I, one of her letters to Emperor Jean Gir, one of Jean Gir's letters to Elizabeth's successor, James I, as well as letters that French and Portuguese missionaries wrote home to their parishes and to their local governments and their families. I also included contemporaneous historians and politicians' accounts. This included Ghulam Hussein Khan and his review of the times. He was a South Asian historian who was writing about 20 to 30 years after all of these events occurred. Edmund Burke, who wrote a history of the Seven Years' War and also provided a speech to Parliament arguing for what was effectively the liberty or the emancipation of all of the South Indian uh, laborers and servants that were working for the East India Company, Emperor Aurangzeb's lamentation, and Lord Clive and Lord Hastings' addresses to Parliament. As far as secondary sources, I had to categorize these, and I used them by topic. So I had a lot of books on the British Empire and the British East India Company, European states, India and South Asia, works that covered exclusively military campaigns in Europe and India, as well as bureaucratic systems, and a lot of the scholars that I drew from were South Asian Marxists and Western centrist scholars. Now, before I go any further, let's take a quick look at a good map of the Mughal Empire, beginning with Babur and ending with Aurangzeb at the beginning of the 18th century. A special thanks to Khan Academy, as this is one of the best comprehensive illustrations of the empire's boundaries. As we can see, the empire stretched from modern eastern Afghanistan through Pakistan eastward to what is modern-day West Bengal and Bangladesh. The unconquered southern tip of the subcontinent consisted of the Maratha Federation as well as Ceylon, or modern Sri Lanka, which included the Kingdom of Kandy. By 1858, as a result of this chain of events we're about to discuss, Britain will control nearly every inch of land south of the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush, which contributed to the empire overseeing 1/6 of the human population. Now let's discuss the chronology of collapse between 1500 and 1757, and I want to emphasize that from its advent, the Mughal Empire began to collapse. Babur's ascent commenced the invasion eastward, but it also started a legitimate internal dispute from his brother. There were external obstacles that existed in the form of natural resistance from native populations and their military leaders, namely Hindu dissidents in the earliest military campaigns. Akbar the Great built upon his predecessors, reforming and restructuring the empire, but even he encountered internal obstacles, which prevented themselves to him in the form of family clashes, namely his half brother and his stepmother. His half-brother was Mirza Khan, and his stepmother was Mariam Makhani. Mirza Khan actually had a legitimate claim to the throne as well, and this, again, presented a serious internal obstacle that was difficult to avoid and chipped away at the legitimacy of what we would consider the legitimate ruler of the Mughal Empire. What made Akbar unique was that he was a bit of a Renaissance man, which was largely the result of the tail end of the Muslim Golden Age. He was very interested in culture, he was very interested in art and music and all sorts of these things that contributed to cultural enrichment, which was why the Catholic states that were exploring India at the time received very warm introductions from Akbar. He was very interested in different religions, and again, this was the result of him being interested in foreign culture. The results of these Portuguese exchanges with the Mughal Empire can still be seen today in Goa, where one might actually think that they are in Lisbon or Porto once they arrive in the city, which still has a considerable Catholic population. On the other hand, the English were not very well received. It was considerably cooler, and one could make the argument that this was largely the result of their cultural disinterest and their greater emphasis on economic and commercial exchange in the form of goods and services. Now, what was interesting was this became a competition, and Portuguese Jesuits were able to leverage their influence in the Mughal courts to denigrate England and her interests. Keep in mind, this was the earliest days of the British East India Company, and their missions here were largely unsuccessful in negotiating the best trade relations, but they at least secured a favorable treaty with Akbar, which may have been the thin blade of the wedge. Akbar initiated the conquest of Deccan, but it was Aurangzeb the Great who completed it, mostly in the latter half of his nearly half-century reign. Now, this is a key moment in history. Because Aurangzeb spent all of his time south in the Deccan on his military campaign, he had to create a regency in the northern provinces. Adding to his dilemmas was the fact that his military campaigns effectively gutted his imperial coffers, and this decentralization of the power in the northern provinces created a situation where the provincial viceroys could effectively develop their own systems of government and their own unique ways of governing their provinces. And this is where Bengal really emerged as the success story of the Mughal Empire in terms of economics, in terms of military power. But it was this last legitimate viceroy in Sirajuddaula who led a disastrous military campaign, which led to a sort of reflexive, albeit successful, conquest by the British East India Company of the Bengal Suba, or province. Portugal initiated the exploration of South Asia with Vasco da Gama's discovery of Calicut. Later, they gained control of Goa from Bijapur, and from there on, they controlled much of the west coast of India. Now, what was interesting about Portugal's exploration of South Asia was that it was in a similar time as their exploration of the New World and of Spain's exploration of the New World, and it brought with it effectively diametrically opposite difficulties. The first difficulty was that the route to South Asia for Portugal was 3 times as long as it was to the New World. The second difficulty was that unlike the Atlantic Ocean, which they encountered no other civilizations to give them trouble or any obstacles, Portugal encountered Venetian and Muslim merchants who controlled much of the maritime routes throughout the waters between Western Europe and South Asia. Thirdly, the South Asian natives were considerably different than the Amerindians, which the European states encountered in the Caribbean, North America, South America, and the New World in general. Namely, that the Amerindians were extremely primitive in contrast to the South Asians, who were incredibly sophisticated technologically, such to the point that they nearly outpaced the Europeans in their military capabilities. Now, despite the fact that today we can't see much of that same sort of influence that Portugal had on South Asia as we can with Britain, what is important to note is that Portugal softened the mission for other European states and their explorations to follow in the coming centuries. The next state we're going to talk about are the Dutch Estates General, which were very much like Britain in that they were an outward-looking seafaring nation with a great deal of money and financial resources poured into their exploratory efforts and their maritime technologies. They commissioned the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, in 1602. Now, this was a very interesting period because the VOC unified all Dutch ships and privateers under the national banner of the newly formed unified provinces. Now, I say that they unified them, but truly they coerced many of those ships uh, by telling them that they could no longer trade or forcing them into a position where they could no longer trade in the future if they did not unify under this banner. By 1619, they defeated both Portuguese and Spanish fleets, and they conquered Malay as well, establishing Batavia in modern Indonesia. In the subcontinent, they created treaties with Mughal dignitaries, which proved advantageous to both the natives and the Dutch, and it rendered the Mughal-Portuguese relations practically useless. But one of their most important contributions at this time period was their innovation of banking and lending practices, which improved their financial prospects, particularly for the VOC. This coincided with sort of financial ruin and misfortune in the Portuguese and Spanish empires at the time. Now, if we step into the Kingdom of France, what we'll see is one of the strangest and sort of backwards and Byzantine operations in South Asia of any of the European states. Theirs came much later than the Estates General, than Britain, than the Portuguese and Spanish empires. And this probably contributed to a lot of their failures. They had mixed results, but most of them did end in ruin or failure, largely because of bureaucratic intransigence and irreconcilable planning. The East India Company was financially unstable from the get-go, and success depended heavily on company leadership rather than the stability of its charter, of its writ. France lost main factories, which were also called trading posts at the time, during the 7 Years' War. They had some success with Duplain law, but ultimately this was going to be a British project. And because of the Treaty of Paris in 1763 ending the 7 Years' War, which was incredibly advantageous to Britain and the British Empire, France became really emasculated and their sort of security apparatus was neutered. They were not able to defend their factories anymore, and within years, Britain overtook their biggest factories, namely that in Pondicherry. Now we're going to look at the emerging hegemons between Britain and the East India Company, and what we'll see here as we examine the two parties is that they really did operate independently of each other, although the East India Company certainly did have a lot of backing from the British Empire and a lot of financial support and operated in support of British imperial interests. Elizabeth I granted the charter to the East India Company on New Year's Eve in 1600. This was a particularly unstable period in English history and British history. You had multiple kings and queens. You had not only Tudor England, but then you had Stuart England. Then you had a military dictatorship in the form of Oliver Cromwell after he killed Charles I in 1649. Then you had a restoration, which resulted in Charles II and James II, who was then overthrown by William III, which brought in what we now know as, or what we can start to see as, the beginnings of the modern British Empire. But if we back up to the beginning of Stuart England, the instability allowed the East India Company, its directors and governors, to exercise some semblance of autonomy and independence. This allowed them to be a lot smoother and avoid a lot of bureaucratic nonsense back in England, which Parliament would have probably otherwise held up. Their East Indian explorations coincided with their explorations in North America. They slowly began chipping away at the European missions in the subcontinent, avoiding military engagements or political exchanges. Again, a huge misconception about Britain's view of the Mughal Empire, which was that they understood, these contemporaneous leaders of the East India Company understood that the Mughal Empire was incredibly sophisticated in its bureaucracy and had a military that was of equal or superior force, both in tactics and technology. The East India Company was ill-equipped to handle anything that the Mughal Empire might throw at them or any of the leaders. But Aurangzeb's death in 1707 and the sort of central authority decay from Delhi created the India that the East India Company would ultimately conquer. What emerged from this was the Bengal province as the strongest province in the empire, largely due to its size, its population, the abundance of resources, the location, its commerce, and its leadership and laws. The East India Company improved its bureaucratic, military, and political apparatuses as well, including expanding diplomatic treaties and factories. In the 1740s, Alivardi Khan's reign, Alivardi Khan being the viceroy or the Nawab of Bengal, was sort of a nationalist approach. It was a pro-Bengali approach, but he also managed to placate a lot of British interests while also appeasing his people. He was sort of a protectionist. He did everything for the Mughal people, namely the Bengali people, including exploiting an increasingly politically and economically powerful banker-trader class that was growing in Bengal. He relinquished control of the Orissa province to sort of satiate the Marathas, with whom the Mughal Empire was constantly at war with, and he leveraged France and Holland against Britain. This latter example showing him to be quite a savvy political leader and being able to play both sides of the fence when it came to the European states. But his death in 1756 and his grandson's succession to the viceroyship was ultimately the Suba, or the province's, undoing. Where Alivardi was a great leader and a very clever politician, Siraj was completely the opposite. He was a poor leader, a poor military strategist, had zero empathy, didn't seem to care much about his people, and waged a really unsuccessful campaign that really ostracized him from his own people, particularly the banker-trader class, which, seeing the damage he was doing, hedged its bets with Britain in an alliance. Now, his adverse actions, particularly in the warfare along the eastern coast, led to the Battle of Plassey, namely the Black Hole of Calcutta incident, which, to be fair, the British press used as sort of a sensationalist, sort of yellow journalist and jingoistic talking point. And in truth, this wasn't really even the fault of Siraj. It was largely an accident. They didn't have a prison equipped well enough to handle the 100 or so prisoners that the Mughal forces captured, and these poor British soldiers died under absolutely horrible and deplorable conditions, where they suffocated due to the close proximity. There was filth all throughout the prison, and it really raised a ruckus in Britain. With the entry of Lord Clive as the governor, the East India Company routed Siraj and his forces. Now, this was a very important battle and victory for the British Empire. Namely, it served as a morale booster to Britain, who was at that point in the late 1750s, waging a fairly unsuccessful war in the 7 Years' War on the European continent, as well as North America. This served as a morale booster, and it gave Britain the opportunity to sort of let the East India Company deal with South Asia independently, and it worked. The East India Company immediately installed Siraj's former courtier as their proxy leader of the Bengal Suba. The 7 Years' War established Britain as the global hegemon, and the Treaty of Paris solidified its power and overlordship over all of the European states in India. The Treaty of Allahabad in 1767 created highly advantageous concessions and conditions which favored the British East India Company over Bengal. Now, in closing, we need to look at what the consequences were of this particular period. And namely, it was that the Mughal Empire suffered almost the exact same fate as other empires throughout human history, to include its conqueror, the British Empire. It established the East India Company as sort of a quasi-official state arm of Britain. Britain would become the administrative overlord of India, absorbing all of the civil and legal matters in Bengal and ultimately India in general. And it undertook many of the military operations that the Bengalis and the Mughal Empire were undertaking in the Mysore Wars throughout the eastern coast. The East India Company almost immediately encountered major dissent in Parliament, but Britain's military victories made it the largest empire in human history, certainly up to that point. The Treaty of Paris expanded Britain's territories and privileges, and it allowed the East India Company to serve as what was effectively the eastern arm of the British Empire in India and South Asia, ultimately conquering Ceylon, which we now know as modern Sri Lanka, Burma, Pakistan, all of these areas. And now for the final part, which is examining what historians get right and what they get wrong. And let's start with what they get wrong, namely that the European states simply exploited Mughal lands and exploited the Mughal native labor completely unmolested. The British Empire just abused the Mughal Empire and took full advantage of what was a weaker and poorer state. The British Empire ushered in an era of imperial exploitation, colonization, and abuse in the form of the British Raj, and the East India Company suffered absolutely no consequences as a result of its exploits. Now, this couldn't be further from the truth. The European states explored and engaged in cultural and commercial exchanges at the earliest times with the Mughal Empire over the course of several centuries. The Mughal Empire was an advanced military state with a highly sophisticated bureaucracy, again, at times of equal or greater superiority than the European states they encountered. The British Empire created an English common law style of administrative government with Indian cultural considerations, and by 1858, Parliament dissolved the East India Company and undertook administrative control of the Raj. Now, finally, the point of this project was not to absolve Britain of any wrongdoing over its colonial vassals, but really to explain that this was a very complicated and complex history that went over the course of nearly 3 centuries, really close to four when you include the 1600s way into the late 19th and early 20th century with Britain's relationship with India. And to simply look at it through a one-sided lens where it was sort of simply a Marxist example of oppressor versus oppressed would be to miss a lot of the rich texture and context of this really complex history between these two regions, these two states, and these two peoples. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.